title of my lecture is Leah, which I hope will become, the meaning of it will become clear. I have a daughter named Leah, so it's special for me to name my lecture after one of the great, after my daughters as well. But of course, the title of the lecture has to do with the mother, one of the mothers of the Jewish people, specifically Leah. ותהר עוד ותלד בן, ותאמר הפעם אודה את השם, כי קראה שמו יהודה, ותעמוד מלדת. And she conceived again, bore a son, and she said, this time I'll thank the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, and she left off bearing. The style in which I'd like to present this lecture is that of a philosophical emulation of the standard Hasidic discursive genre known as Ach Ha'inyan, which loosely translates as "but the matter." It's a Hasidic style of Maimar or whatever, the Tanya in particular. The style can be thought of as a kind of commentary on a verse. In this case, Genesis 29:35, which I just read, which verse also gives me my lecture its title. Basically, in the Ach Ha'inyan style, the innermost part of a given verse, what Hasidic thinking calls the pnimiyut, in Greek esoterikos, the innermost or the inner more, is examined, and the work of connecting the interiority to the exoteric sense of the verse is for the most part left to the listener or the reader. At the end of my lecture, I'll return to Genesis 29:35 and offer some thoughts about the connection I myself see between the verse and my subject matter. But the work of the connection I will leave for discussion. The subject matter at hand, the inyan, that immediately concerns me here, is to be found in the first chapter of the Torah. It is the thesis to be found there that the world is very good. And by the way, I've given you a sheet there which lays out my argument step by step. I wish I had done what Elliot did yesterday with giving text, but I didn't have time to do that. So what I've done is I've laid out my argument with the titles that I've given as different sections, and I'll call them out. So at least to give you an orientation of what my argument is, which follows more or less logically, I hope. So number one, the world is very good. So teaches Genesis 1. Vayar Elokim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. This phrase appears 6 times in the first chapter of the book of Genesis. God created light, Vayar Elokim et haor ki tov, and God saw the light that it was good. God created the earth and the seas, Vayar Elokim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. God creates the vegetable kingdom, creates the sun and the moon, creates birds to fill the sky and fish to fill the seas. God creates land animals to roam the earth. And regarding each of these creations, the Torah says, Vayar Elokim ki tov. Finally, on the eve of the first Sabbath, God looks at everything He's made. Vayar Elokim et kol asher asa. And the word tov, good, in the phrase used 6 times until then, is shifted to a new phrase to suit the synoptic divine vision. And behold, it was very good. Vehine tov me'od. This word tov, as it appears in the first chapter of the Torah, is my subject matter in this lecture. The word tov, as I'm sure you're well aware, makes many additional appearances in the Tanakh after the first biblical chapter. Already in the second chapter of Genesis, for instance, it appears in juxtaposition with its contrary, Ra, in the name of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The fruit of the tree, as you know, opens up the great problematization of goodness, which may be called the moral problematization. In the 4th chapter of Genesis, for example, God reminds Cain that he has the option to incline toward goodness or not. Im teitiv ve'im lo teitiv. And it's probably safe to assume that all the subsequent appearances of the word tov in the Bible, including the ones pertaining to moral action, are informed by its debut in Genesis 1, which is not necessarily a moral usage of the word tov, good. Here, though, keeping those other appearances in the wings of my mise en scène, I would like to focus on Genesis 1 and the word tov as it appears there in particular. And here is the end in the title of our symposium. And because the optical instrumentation with which this focusing is to be carried out is a philosophical one, the focus may be called ontological in the broadest, loosest sense of the word. I mean in the sense that the being of things, which is said to be good in Genesis 1, is what is under consideration. In Heideggerian terminology, my question concerning the Hebrew word tov is a question to be posed in relation to das Seiende, which I'd like to translate, if you let me, as the thing. By the way, it's not Noy Valega, who was a great scholar of Heidegger, who lives in California, I believe. She was a student of von Hermann's. She translates sometimes as thing, and I like the translation. It's not a great translation, thing, but I think it's doable. Yes, sometimes it's translated as being with a small b, or entity, and so on. And thing is problematic because there is in German also das Ding, which for Heidegger is quite different from das Seiende. But I hope, just please bear with me. I hope, and just to put my cards on the table, one of the main reasons, if not the main reasons, I want to translate it as that the thing, is simply to put it in contrast, in juxtaposition with the Hebrew davar, which I'll get to at the end of the lecture. The goodness of things is to be examined in terms of the Seiendheit des Seiendes, or the Anwesenheit des Seiendes. In the first chapter of the book of Genesis, just to translate those, the beinghood of beings, or the presence of beings, or the thing. In the first chapter of the book of Genesis, a chapter of such sui generis distinction and importance that the sages had to assign it the special title of Maaseh Bereshit, the workings or the doings of the beginning, which title came to include the entire Kabbalistic field of speculation. In this, Elliot mentioned yesterday that there are three others. In this first chapter, we find the implicit thesis, which my task in this lecture is to make explicit in a philosophical, ontological, Heideggerian manner. Namely, that heaven and earth are full of good things, and that the world is very good, tov me'od. Two quick disclaimers. Number one, in employing the word world, of course, I'm already stepping back from the biblical text. As you may know, there is no word in biblical Hebrew corresponding to the word world, Welt, or in any of our European languages. The Torah speaks of the heavens and the earth. And this simple fact in and of itself is this conspicuous lacuna probably constitutes the single most powerful piece of documentary evidence for the argument that I will be making. Since, however, my argument approaches the topic philosophically, I am relying on the introduction made by the Chazal, by the sages, of the word olam to the discussion of Maaseh Bereshit, a word fitted to its use by the sages presumably under the influence of Hellenism. Cosmos, among other things, Tohen and so on, Topan, whatever. My second disclaimer, I will rely on the adverb very and very good to exempt my argument from any questions of theodicy, of the problem of evil. Not every single thing in the world needs to be good for the world to be very good. The adverb, after all, is not a superlative. The world is not necessarily the best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz said and as Voltaire made fun of. It will be taken for granted that the fact of evil does not make it necessary to put God on trial for claiming to make a very good world. How do we approach the thesis that the world is very good, a world full of good things? The important thing, it seems to me, is to stay as close as possible specifically to those philosophically profound usages of the word good which coincide in a magical way with the most mundane possible usages, particularly the kind we find in Levinas. For example, when he says that we live from good soup, air, light, spectacles. We live from bread. This is all from Levinas. Levinas even says, and this is a vital philosophical addition, I believe, we live from a good cigarette. I think it's very important. By the way, in the handout, there's a picture of there from probably one of my two favorite movies of all time, Himmel über Berlin by Wim Wenders. And in this scene, Columbo, Peter Falk, is talking to an angel by a kiosk, Imbiss heißt es, no? These little kiosks. And he's trying to convince the angel to become human. And Peter Falk is standing where he has a cigarette and he has a coffee, and he says, it's so wonderful here. When you have a cigarette, it's so geschmack, it's so wonderful, and a coffee, and when you put them together, it's so good.
And if you do it together, it's fantastic.
To me, that moment encapsulates, in a way, what Levinas is saying and what I want to get at. This everyday living from mundane good things, such as good bread and good soup, Levinas simply calls jouissance, enjoyment. Not in the sense that Lacan uses this word, very different sense. When Esav enjoys the warm lentil soup and the fresh bread that his brother gives him, Yaakov, this simple enjoyment is sheltered and hosted within the meaning of the "it was good" of Maaseh Breshit in an exemplary fashion. In the astronautic ascent to the celestial perspective of Maaseh Breshit, to be sure, the question concerning the good becomes even more sublime and abstract. But in the end, after the re-entry into this terrestrial perspective, everything that I wish to communicate in this lecture to follow boils down metaphorically and literally to a good bowl of soup. Okay, number two now. This is my second proposition. As a Hebraic teaching, the very good world teaching of Genesis 1 can be elucidated philosophically in a chiaroscuro juxtaposition with Heideggerian thinking. And what of Heideggerian thinking? What does Heidegger have to teach about good soup? To my knowledge, Heidegger has no memorable teachings concerning good soup. Maybe you guys will correct me. He does have some important things to say about fine wine, thanks to Hölderlin. But wine is something else. The goodness of wine is bound up with the aesthetic dimension, whence a wine is typically characterized as a fine wine rather than a good wine, and with the astronautic trajectory of exiting the mundane ecstatically, in the Greek sense of the word, rather than with the path of re-entry, with which I'm interested in here. If no teaching is to be found in Heidegger's curriculum which can shed light on the goodness of a good soup or anything like good soup, something which is to be found there, a thinking that provides a special, majestic darkness, I would call it, like the great black swaths in the paintings of Rembrandt and Caravaggio. I hope everybody knows what I'm talking about. This is an important word for me here. You know what chiaroscuro is, yeah? In art, if you see the beautiful paintings of Rembrandt, often half the painting is black. It's a great painting of the prophet Jeremiah. He's sitting in the corner, and just pure black. And this chiaroscuro in Italian means light dark. In other words, the play of light and darkness. And of course, the effect of chiaroscuro is that the object emerges in the light very powerfully because it's set against the darkness. Caravaggio is another great example of this. If you know the beautiful paintings of, for example, St. Paul under the horse there. So a special majestic darkness in which the Hebraic teaching becomes illuminated in chiaroscuro. Now, I'd like to go out on a limb here and propose a somewhat risque interpretation of a peculiar aspect of Heideggerian thinking, which gives it this special chiaroscurante power. On Monday, I recalled how Heidegger was a card-carrying National Socialist for 4 months in 1933, 1934. The somewhat risky and possibly risque assumption that I would like to add today, and I hope we get to discuss this without getting too deeply into it now, is that there is an ineradicable Nazi-ish root to Heideggerian thinking. And the ish is very important here. Heidegger was never a genocidal or homicidal National Socialist. And if he was an anti-Semite, his anti-Semitism utterly lacked the operatic pizzazz and the passion that Sartre attributes to the phenomenon. Heidegger was not a Hitler or an Eichmann, nor was he even a Bäumler or a Schmidt. He was, like such men, neither in practice nor, more importantly, in theory. There is one and only one way in which Heidegger remained consistently true to National Socialism, according to his own confession made in 1933 in his lecture series Introduction to Metaphysics, which confession he conscientiously upheld in the 1953 publication of the text, about which Pögler speaks so much about. He remained true to what he called the innere Wahrheit und Größe, the inner truth and greatness of National Socialism. It is this esoterikos dimension, this esoteric dimension of National Socialism alone that interests me. The esoteric inner dimension is something that I understand along the lines that Heidegger uses the term essence, Wesen. The essence of technology, says Heidegger, is not something itself technological. Likewise, the inner truth of National Socialism is not itself something Nazi. Adorno claimed that he could feel in Heideggerian thinking something fascistic down to its innermost cellular level. This is not quite my assumption. I would rather say, first of all, that Heidegger's thinking is not fascistic at all. And secondly, that it's not down to, but rather at its most innermost level, that Heideggerian thinking harbors a non-Nazi chromosome which contains genetic instructions, as it were, for the development, functioning, and growth of certain characteristics that are vital to Nazism. I hope that point is understood. Let me put it in terms of Hannah Arendt's suggestive formulation, the banality of evil. This formula can be taken to mean that the evil perpetrated in Auschwitz was characterized by a banal attitude, a perfunctory, bureaucratic, yawn-suppressing attitude to running the gas chambers. But the term banality can also be read as a strong noun rather than such a substantivized adjective. And it seems to me that this is Arendt's real point. Banality can be grasped as the chromosomal core of evil perpetrated in Auschwitz. For centuries before this evil finally blossomed in the Wannsee Conference and in Eichmann's tour de force in Auschwitz, the banality per se had to be carefully cultivated and securely rooted in certain patches of German soil. It is something of this same banality that seems to be legible in Heidegger's understanding of the word good. In the context and the text in which, according to his own testimony later on, he intrepidly stepped down into the ring to engage in hand-to-hand combat in an Auseinandersetzung mit dem Nationalsozialismus, which can only mean an Auseinandersetzung between the inner truth of Nazism and Nazism's outer truth, namely, in his Nietzsche lectures of 1936-1940, there Heidegger offers an elucidative translation of the word good in the context of reading Plato. He is explaining Plato's idea of the good, to agathon, and he writes, I quote, "In a Greek and also Platonic manner of speaking, agathon means the suitable, das Taugliche. What suits something, etwas taugt, and itself makes something else suitable. And as that which makes suitable, tauglich machendes, the agathon is that which makes possible, ermöglichendes, a kind of transcendental condition of visible phenomena. That the simple elemental word good is susceptible of any translation other than its obvious counterparts in other languages, such as gut, is questionable enough, I think. That the suitable, das Taugliche, is an adequate translation of to agathon is very questionable, I think, to say the least. Not only is this a far cry from the demonic excess that's a quote from Plato, of the sun-like idea of the good as Plato portrays it in the Republic. It is an even farther cry from all those things down in the world which are good because they receive their goodness from the idea of the good above, in a way that Plato compares to the way living things receive the life and warmth from the sun. In relation to the goodness of a good warm soup, this notion of the suitable is, I believe, an appallingly banal translation of the good. It is a notion that belongs to the inner truth of Nazism. And note that it is an esoterically Nazi notion of the good, not of evil. The evil that bloomed and flowered and burgeoned in Auschwitz as the evil of a systematic gassing to death of hundreds of thousands of children is an evil that is rooted in a positive, beneficial suitability, Tauglichkeit. And I don't have in mind here a bureaucratic notion of suitability, like the virtue of efficiency, for example, what Hilberg discusses. I have in mind the consinity, whereby Dasein actively suits itself to Sein as das Geschickliche, that which fits well. The Zugehörigkeit, whereby the human being belongs to being, is not just passively, but by virtue of that active participation in being, which is thinking. I'm here now at number 3. The very good world thesis, in particular, can be elucidated in chiaroscuro with Heidegger's notion of Welt. My basic thesis, again, is that the Heideggerian thing, das Seiende, provides an illuminating darkness which brings the thing of Genesis 1 into the light as something good. In order to understand what Heidegger means by das Seiende, of course, it is necessary to understand what he means by das Sein, being, with a capital B. But I propose to arrive at the question of being only after taking up the theme which is the obvious counterpart of Olam, namely the theme of Welt, world. This, of course, is a major theme, if not the thematic matrix, I would say, of Sein und Zeit, of being in time, and beyond as well. More in being in time, obviously, but it survives in other writings. How is the chiaroscuro juxtaposition of Welt and Olam to take place? Does Heidegger anywhere allude to the Hebraic teaching of Olam? Is there anything in his writings to warrant a chiaroscuro exercise in relationship to Hebraic teaching? I would say yes and yes. Heidegger touches on the Hebraic teaching of Olam in 2 places. In the Schwarze Heften, in the Black Notebooks, he specifically mentions the relationship of Judaism to the world in a manner that can be taken as symptomatic. That's number 1. Number 2, throughout his writings, he makes regular reference to the doctrine of creation as an inheritance relayed to Western metaphysics via Christian theology, of course, originally bequeathed by the Hebrew Old Testament. Here I must leave the second more substantial Heideggerian treatment of Olam to discussion. And it is more substantial, and I hope we'll talk about it. There's a lot to say about it. But here I'll limit myself to the remark from the Black Notebooks. Number 4, such chiaroscuro juxtaposition is suggested in Heidegger's own remark about the worldlessness of Judaism. This remark from the Black Notebooks reads as follows, in English, obviously. One of the most hidden forms of the gigantic, and perhaps the oldest, is the tenacious dexterity at calculating and shoving and shuffling, whereby the worldlessness of Judaism is founded. Die Weltlosigkeit des Judentums. This is one sentence, just one sentence found in the 5th edition of Martin Heidegger's Überlegung, number 8, contained in volume 95 of the Gesamtausgabe, which we have in our possession, thanks to Peter, thanks to him for more than one reason, among a very small melanomatic constellation of remarks about Judaism. By itself, the remark is negligible and probably nothing to worry about. By a deliberately symptomatological approach to it, on the other hand, it is arguably very useful as an indication of a malaise in Heideggerian thinking, which is possibly anti-Semitic, but in any case, more importantly, anti-Torah. I want to make that distinction, which I think is important. By the way, I had a brief exchange with Heidegger's grandson over this, and he said to me, that the Großvater war nicht antisemitisch. He says, but he might have been anti-Judish. In other words, his remarks in the Black Notebooks are anti-Judaism, perhaps, but not anti-Semitic, and I, frankly, completely agree with him. Please keep in mind that nothing more than a symptom is at stake, but also nothing less. I would like the symptomatic remark I would liken this symptomatic remark to what Freud calls a Leistungsfehler, a parapraxis, a slip of the tongue. What's a mere lapsus linguae, what is a slip of the tongue, a lapsus linguae? Nothing, really. And yet this nothing really, this tiny bacterium seen under a good microscope reveals everything. Basically, this number 5 now, basically what's good according to the very good world thesis stands juxtaposed to what in Heideggerian thinking is the availability and suitability of things. So, Welt. The Heideggerian remark under the microscope in hand passes judgment on Judaism for what is taken to be a grave deficiency. The worldlessness of Judaism. Judaism is deficient in world. Why? Because Judaism is otherworldly, because the Hebrew prophets, as Nietzsche says, use the word world as a schimpfwort, as a cuss word for the first time in history. And if the remark is not anti-Semitic, and even quite intuitive on Heidegger's part, what is it about Judaism that Heidegger seeks to criticize by appealing to the notion of world? How does the criticism sit with his revolutionary notion in being of time of in der Welt sein, being in the world? To grab the question by the horns, I think it's necessary to recall what being in the world means in being in time. No phenomenon, including the phenomenon of Judaism, according to being in time, can be worldless in some jelly bean kitty abstract sense of being without the world. The Jew's worldlessness is not something like the worldlessness of a stone, which Heidegger writes about in other contexts. I've read some people who compared it to that, and I think it's ridiculous. For Heidegger, the phrase being without a world is neither a contradiction in terms nor blithely meaningless, and it is an unusable phrase, not merely like a proposition, say, about a fish swimming outside of water. For the impossibility of such a fish swimming outside of water is mostly determined by a weak imagination. No doubt more than one little Japanese girl or boy mesmerized for the first time by a koinorobi carp windstalk billowing in the wind has imagined the fantastical possibility of a fish swimming out of water quite vividly. I hope you know what I'm talking about, those beautiful fish-like flags that they have in Japan. Likewise, it's possible to imagine a human being floating in a worldless void, like an astronaut in space. What is impossible to imagine is an astronaut without any concerns binding him or her to anything. Concerns over her oxygen supply, for example, her spacesuit, her spaceship, ground control, planet Earth, her family, etc. That's not really conceivable. Speaking in more precise Heideggerian terms, then, it would have to be said that the deficiency that afflicts Judaism concerns not Welt, properly speaking, but Weltlichkeit, worldhood. It's a difficult word to translate. But specifically, the world, die Welt, in its Weltlichkeit, in its worldhood. If the term world refers to the total sum of things, a sum like the universe, then the phrase worldhood of the world refers to how this totality accommodates our lives in our full-bodied embodiment with everything that surrounds us, with our Umwelt, our environment, as the sum total of what concerns us. Worldhood is, I quote here from Being in Time, the how of being in which the entity called world shows itself from itself as the encountered. Still quoting the wherein-hood as the possibility of being, whereby being in accommodates the encounter. The natural acoustic resonance that the English word neighborhood bears to the word worldhood, I think, is useful here, just as one's neighborhood is not defined merely by the buildings and the sidewalks and the fences and the trees which one passes on the way to the corner store. Worldhood is not defined by any multiplicity of things in the world, but rather by the way the world makes things available for meaningful encounter. To go along with the patent Heideggerian example, a farmer, say, is kneeling on the roof of his barn on the last day of summer. His pocket is full of iron or steel nails 2 nails are sticking out between his pressed lips, and a hammer is in hand. For him, the ready-to-hand hammer offers its functional suitability, bewandtnis, for hammering. This is now a quote from Heidegger. In this hammering, there is suitability for making something sturdy. In this, the suitability is for protecting against inclement weather. And this is for the sake of accommodating Dasein. This is all from Being and Time. The way that the nails, the hammer, the prospect of a good roof, and everything else in his immediate and projected life environment is available to the farmer, the way that that way is the worldhood of the farmer's world. All these things that encounter him make up the referential totality, the Verweisungsganzheit, which refers to a suitability totality, the Bewandtnisganzheit. This totality is not simply a very large and comprehensive collection of things. It's a totality which is amenable to human enterprises, like the hammering of the farmer on his barn roof, and within which various things make themselves available to being applied by and for human needs. It is a wherein, a worin, and a to which, a woraufhin of applicability. And let me quote here the closest thing to a definition of worldhood offered in Being and Time. I quote here, it's one of these wild Heideggerian sentences. The wherein of understanding, which refers itself to various things, in other words, to the extent that this wherein is regarded as that to which of allowing things to be encountered in the manner of being that is suitability, bewandtnis, as I'm translating, is the phenomenon of world. And the structure of that to which woraufhin Dasein refers is what makes up the Weltlichkeit, the worldhood of the world. If Dasein refers itself to the world in the direction of world, which suggests a certain passive receptivity to on the part of the world is receptive. How does the active, self-interpolating side of the encounter express itself? For this active being in the world, Heidegger reserves the nomenclatural catchword besorgen, concern. Worldhood and concern are 2 sides of the same coin. The world frees up various things within it and gives them over into the hands of concern. Heidegger stresses that even when Dasein sits back with folded arms as if utterly unconcerned, this too must be seen as a deficient mode of concern. Whenever there is some kind of anatomical redistribution of the body's center of gravity from the hands to the eyes, from handling things to some purely theoretical contemplation of things, those things in the world which otherwise make themselves available to Dasein as zu handen, as ready to hand, recede into a fallow state of being merely present to hand or close to hand, vorhanden. But the default state of things in the world is one of making themselves available to Zuhandenheit, where the hand reaches, grasps, takes, manipulates, handles. While even a basically ocular scientific observation of the world as nature, as the universe, as an absolute thing, the biggest Sein de, not Sein, but Sein de, is still concern, albeit concern at a cool minimum. This is not concern's normal temperature. I'm talking about the relationship of Vorhandenheit, which is for Heidegger with theoretical speculation or theoretical thinking. Science is all about. Being in the world, this is a quote, being in the world as concern is mesmerized, I would say, as a translation of benomen, by the world of its concern. But here we have to be very careful, I believe, not to overestimate the warmth of concern. To begin with, we have to carefully gauge the relative coolness of the world in its making itself suitable to concern. And by the way, I've been using the English word suitability to translate Heidegger's bewandtnis. I called Peter a couple of months ago to ask him to help me to understand this word. This word is notoriously difficult to translate to import into English. Bewandtnis has been translated as involvement, relevance, functionality, and appliance. Without getting into the aims and the inadequacies of these translations, the main thing I'd like to note about Bewandtnis is the way it thematizes the availability of things. Things make themselves available. The way things in the world are freed up for Dasein's various worldly concerns. Here I quote again, letting something be suitable, bewenden lassen, understood ontologically, is the prior setting free of things to its readiness to hand within the environment. Were we to indulge ourselves and enjoy the friendly and generous mood which seems to radiate from this freeing up and availability of Heidegger's, we might imagine that the world in its worldhood were being portrayed as some lovely little gift by some benevolent divinity, or perhaps some divinity itself, like a maternal Gaia, a mother goddess, giving herself to human needs and involvements. But Heidegger makes it quite clear that an ontological discourse makes no room for such poetic enchantment. The world is not that warm. The world is given in the way that a datum in Latin is given. Not scientific, I mean the etymological sense of datum, a given. It is given in the coolness of facticity and Geworfenheit, of thrownness. A rather frigid welcome to Dasein obliges Dasein to find itself in the world, I quote here, in a finding that springs not so much from a direct search, but rather from a fleeing, a Flucht, looking away. Accordingly, the mood in which the world is received is a mood a mood of flight known as Angst. And as I hope you know, it's a big section in Being in Time about anxiety. An unheimlich sense of not being at home. Zuhause. The overall relatively frigid reception whereby the world makes itself suitable and nothing more than suitable to human beings has a significant impact on the way concern itself takes hold of suitable things. Not expecting too much from the world, Heidegger sets the natural temperature of concern, of the Sorge of care, which is at the heart of Besorgen, of concern, well below the vital warmth levels that these two words, Sorge and Besorgen, normally carry in German, like in English, like in any language. Heidegger takes pains to make this artificial calibration of temperature quite clear. He warns his reader to maintain a very tight grip on the ontological meaning of Besorgen, which resonates with ontic inflections of the word, which indicate a busyness, an Umgang, of, here I quote again, of having to do with something, producing something, applying something, undertaking, accomplishing, exploring. What I find noteworthy about the list here is what it leaves out from the tallying of even among these ontic, not ontological, ontic forms of concern from which Heidegger would have the reader extract a purely ontological term. Why is there no mention in this list of concerns with some hint of nervous excitement, delight, enjoyment, or gratitude for things that concern us, or likewise, on the other hand, with some worry or grief that haunts frustrated concern? What is true of Besorgen, moreover, is even more true of Sorge, which is the core of Besorgen. Regarding care, Heidegger flat out forbids the reader to hear in this ontological term any overtones of Mühsal, troubles, of Trübsinn, melancholy, of Lebenssorge, cares of life, or of the etymologically related Besorgnis, of worry. In exsanguinating words like care and concern of the lifeblood that courses through their veins in living human language, of course, Heidegger is carrying out a procedure that is standard philosophical practice after all. He's not the first to do it. But in this particular case, issues arise because the usual problems created by the inevitable residual acoustic reverberations and the static that accomplishes the philosophical retooling of words found in the vernacular. There is reason to suspect, I would say, a certain cavalier attitude of Heidegger's in this case. Since Heidegger does not turn to words that have a naturally lower temperature and emotional impassivity, we have to wonder to what extent he is capitalizing on the constitutionally, the normal, natural resonances of care and concern, Sorge und Besorgen? Does he not offer with his cool retooling of these words ersatz forms, joyless, loveless ersatz forms of concern and care as the basic constitution of Dasein? Now, just to be a bit more technical and precise, concern is a structural component of care. Care, taken as a whole, structure is defined as ahead of itself, already being in the world. This is all with hyphens in German and in English, as being alongside things encountered within the world. It is specifically the latter half of this structure that I just quoted that constitutes concern per se, being alongside, bei. In English, there's no way to translate bei, sein bei. Like, bei mir bist du schön, we say in Yiddish, right? Chez moi in French, you could say, but in English, they translate alongside, which is unfortunate. Being alongside things. Concern, which is preoccupied with things, das Seiende, and specifically with things in their instrumentality. Heidegger says, we call the thing encountered in concern the Zeug, the tool. This is integrated into the full structure of care, where it is brought into the service of care in a narrow sense, in the sense of the former part of the structure. Care in the narrow sense is ahead, this is a quote again of this phrase, ahead of itself already being in the world. Or what amounts to the same, Dasein is its self-projective being towards its own most possibility of being. It is in this narrow sense of care, in fact, that the essence of care shows itself to be temporality, since Zeitlichkeit is where Dasein projects itself into its own future. Crudely put, concern provides the hands with which Dasein pulls itself into its destiny, almost like Munchausen. Munchausen pulls himself up, but let's say, if you imagine Munchausen pulling himself forward with his own hands, as it were. Things get even more technical, of course. The only reason I bring in this distinction here is to underscore the manner in which concern is oriented by what might be called this is my term, but I take it from Buber and also from Levinas, the ontological selfishness of so-called care. Care and concern, as heard in the Heideggerian vocabulary, never attain to anything like love. There is no love for fellow human beings in Heidegger, as Buber and Levinas have shown poignantly and extensively. There is certainly no love for God. And as for love for being, that too, I would say, is ruled out by definition, not because Heidegger lacks passion for being, but rather because passion, as I will argue, is not the same thing as love, and is in essence, in some ways, I believe, the opposite of love. This is also something Peter and I have discussed at length about eros, eroticism, as a specific type of love, which is in many ways inimical to other forms of love. And most to the point of my argument about the Hebrew word tov in Genesis 1, this is my thesis here, there is no love of things, no love of a good soup. On the best of days, Dasein is mesmerized by the world of its concern, yes. But there's nothing like a love for the world, nothing like enjoyment, jouissance, nothing like a good soup. On the best of days, the world makes itself suitable, like a handy tool, Zeug. The spoon makes itself suitable to the hand, and the soup makes itself suitable to the tongue and to the stomach. I'll have to come back to what happens to the word Welt in Heidegger's vocabulary with the so-called Kehre, the turn of the early 1930s. For now, enough has been said for the sake of asking the following question. Assuming that such an understanding of Welt, which we find in Being and Time, is in fact at play in Heidegger's claim that Judaism is weltlos, worldless, can it be said that the claim that Heidegger makes is mistaken? Is Judaism truly worldless, meaning, of course, worldhoodless? Judaism is indeed worldless. Number 6 here. This is where Heidegger is, I would say, correct. The answer to my question, which I just asked, it seems to me, is yes, indeed. Judaism is indeed profoundly worldless, worldhoodless. At least if Genesis 1 is to be taken as Judaism's first and last word on the matter. Heidegger is not mistaken. Not mistaken. Not mistaken. Does this mean that Heidegger's view of Judaism is right? So Heideggerian thinking is not an esoteric National Socialist anti-Jewish thinking? Heidegger's thinking is a philo-Judaic thinking? Question. This is a question. Here I think we need to make a distinction, and I hope you will indulge me. I would distinguish this is actually something that's very good in English. In German, as Peter and I found out, it's very hard to do this, but I would distinguish in English, at least for today's purposes, the correctness of Heidegger's estimation of Judaism from any ability on his part to see what is right about his estimation. Where the term right includes the moral, legal difference between right and wrong in English, while the term correct entails only the difference between true and false. To say that Judaism is worldless is not false. It's basically correct. It's true. To say or to suggest that something is profoundly out of joint with Judaism worldlessness, which Heidegger tries to say, that's wrong, I think. It's a wrong perpetrated against Judaism, even though it's right. And here, of course, is the irony. To wrong Judaism in this way is something that Heidegger can do precisely because his view of Judaism is correct. He's saying the truth about Judaism. He just doesn't understand what he's saying. What does Judaism teach about worldlessness? How is this teaching right? Not just a teaching of truth of which can be presented in a philosophical argument, but more importantly, a teaching that exemplifies tzedek in the sense of, like the Hebrew word tzedek, tzodek in Hebrew is like you're right in English. It could mean either you're right in the sense of correct or you're morally and legally in your rights. Number 7. The Hebrew sources teach worldlessness, that is, worldhoodness. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void. The darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the breath of God moved upon the face of the waters. What can be learned about the Hebraic notion of olam from these two first lines of Genesis 1 of the Torah? How does the hermeneutic tradition of Judaism bring these verses to us? And I'm implicitly here assuming, like Gadamer and Levinas and Hillel from the Talmud, that there's no such thing as a bare text which appears naked of any reading tradition or Masorah. The Hebrew commentaries on the first verse of the Torah, of course, are far beyond pearls in both value and number. As a matter of convenience, the commentary of Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, the Ramban, may serve as a solid, straightforward entry point. Nachmanides explains the meaning of the word bara, created, as follows. The Holy One, blessed be He, created all created beings from absolute nothingness. And we have no word in the holy tongue for bringing something from nothing, hayesh me'ayin, other than the word bara, end quote. After then explaining the Kabbalistic alphabetic etymologies of the words tohu and bohu, void and emptiness, whatever, formlessness and void, the former in particular in terms of a pure hylic potential that could only be named through a frustrating process of repeated erasure and renaming, Nachmanides cites a verse from Isaiah in which tohu appears in a political rather than cosmogonic context. He says, I quote, this is actually from Isaiah, less than nothing and tohu are they considered to him. That's Isaiah. For tohu, this is now the Ramban, Nachmanides, tohu comes in the order of creation right after nothing, but is not yet a nothing. And thus they stated in Sefer Yetzirah, he created from tohu and made it there isn't and there is. Yeshno, eno yeshno. In Latin, creatio ex nihilo. And appealing to the notion of hule, and its imported conceptual framework, of course, Nachmanides is unpacking the meaning of tohu in the Aristotelian lingua franca of medieval philosophers. It would be easy enough to raise all kinds of questions about the constitution of the primordial hule and its paradoxical neither nothing nor something ontological status, and this would keep the entire issue safely shut away inside the confines of metaphysical discourse. Nachmanides, however, veers away from metaphysics very quickly when he recalls the Hebrew etymology of tohu given in the ancient Kabbalistic text, which Elliot mentioned yesterday, the Bahir, which says, what is tohu? Something that confounds, taha. The same etymology is implicit in Rashi's translation of tohu in his medieval French word estourdissant, or in modern French, étourdissant, astounding, staggering. Tohu is not like chaos in Greek, chaos, in the sense of a pre-cosmic situation that lacks cosmos, order. It's the frozen and inwardly vibrating trauma of an Unwelt, an infinite vertigo constantly prodded to the edge of its own precipice. Does this not bring the nothingness of creatio ex nihilo into the playing field of Heidegger's 1929 essay, What is Metaphysics, with its interpretation of the nihil, the nothing, of metaphysics in terms of angst, anxiety? Is this the nothingness which prompts the great metaphysical question posed by Leibniz? Why is there nothing at all rather than, is there anything at all rather than nothing? While the tohu, which astonishes and confounds, is certainly not far from Heidegger's anxiety, there is, I think, a marked difference in a basic mood, Grundstimmung, that places the astonishment of tohu beyond the clear night and nothing of anxiety, as Heidegger calls it. The surpassing of beings as a whole shows pure nothing to be identical to pure being. And the tohu, or the isn't, implicit in Genesis 1. The difference in mood resounds in the verse that Nachmanides takes from Isaiah. Less than nothing and tohu are they considered to him. What does Isaiah mean by this? What's he talking about? In the context, this refers to the Babylonian invaders who, along with the other belligerent nations in the region, are bent on Israel's demise. Isaiah's words are meant to console and encourage Jerusalem and the people of Israel. Comfort ye, my people, saith the Lord, is how Isaiah begins his chapter in this message. The word tohu is part of a vigorously rhetorical message, the purpose of which is to expose the immateriality of the threat encroaching upon Israel. They are nothing, they're less than nothing. The existence of the great Babylonian empire of Nebuchadnezzar is, in a sense, a sham. The empire exists, obviously it exists, but it is, alas, no hallucination, and yet its existence per se, as existence, contains an essential nothingness in the ontological fabric of its wherewithal to threaten as a matter for concern. It is this rhetoric of inner nothingness expressed in Isaiah and Nachmanides that extends to the universe as a whole. Tohu is an almost nothing, an essentially nothing, a sheer hyphen of a nothing something. Appearing in its Greek metaphysical guise of hule again, it certainly gives the impression of being something rather than nothing, however insubstantial the something may be, but this something is nothing to be concerned about. That's the key. In the ultimate scheme of things, just like the massive armies of Nebuchadnezzar are of no ultimate significance in Israel, in God's plans for Israel. Indeed, the utter emptiness of the threat directly corresponds to the fullness of divine comfort. Or is this simply reading just too much into Isaiah? After all, Nachmanides also cites the teaching from the other ancient Kabbalistic text, the Sefer Yetzirah, which seems to resonate very well with the metaphysical tone of terms like hule and nihil. He created being from tohu and made the yeshno eino, the there isn't, there is. Is this not basically the ex nihilo of theological thinking? The expression from the manuscript version of the Sefer Yetzirah used by Nachmanides appears, just because I mentioned it because there's more than one version, it appears in its native esoteric context as follows. He formed reality from tohu and made the there isn't into a there is, eino yeshno, and carved great pillars from air that cannot be grasped. This divine cosmogonic act of carving and engraving, chakika, is an art of writing in stone with a chisel. Here I will quote the beginning of the Sefer Yetzirah. 22 letters. This, as Elliot mentioned yesterday, is at least one of, will correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the first two major texts of Kabbalah, the other being the Sefer Bahir. So this is the Sefer Yetzirah. It says as follows, 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. He engraved them, he hewed them, he weighed them, and he exchanged them and combined them and formed them with the soul of everything that was formed and the soul of everything that would be formed in the future. How did he weigh them and exchange them? Aleph with all, and all with Aleph, Bet with all, and all with Bet, Gimel with all, and all with Gimel, and they repeated the cycle. The entire Sefer Yetzirah is an account of what I would call the quantum alphabetics, whereby the world is created. Just as a reality observed from the physico-chemical perspective, which was inaugurated in John Dalton's 1808, the new system of chemical philosophy bespeaks an unseen parallel universe of molecules and atoms at an invisible quantum level. The same reality, regarded from the perspective of a consciousness that experiences the world as a kind of communication, the same reality, what's called creation, is composited on a kind of quantum basis from the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The mathematics of this is worked out in the Sefer Yetzirah in terms of 231 gates, as they're called, combinations of possible Hebrew proto-words, if you could call them that, which have biliteral roots. These being the basis of triliteral roots of the majority of actual Hebrew words. You know, in Hebrew, most words have a three-letter root at its source, like all Semitic languages. A popular example given by an early Hasidic master says, with regard to the Hebrew word for stone, even, that the combination of the root letters Aleph, Bet, Nun of even descends from the 10 utterances, meaning the 10 instances of "and God said" in the first two chapters of Genesis, and is derived from them, and this is the life force, the chayut of the stone, of the rock. Without entering into the quantum alphabetics and the details reserved for the Kabbalistically initiated, the general import of the teaching should be evident, I think. The teaching constitutes a Kabbalistically scientific commentary on the third verse of the Torah and its 9 counterparts in Genesis 1, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. It's the first word of the verse in particular that calls for commentary, Vayomer, and he said. The first thing that is, and it is, a yeshno, is light. The light is made by the Hebrew word for light, or, a holy word spoken in the holy tongue by the Holy One. Like every word after it, this word precedes the thing as the thing's true in essence. This is what makes the word a communication. Vayomer, he said, he's communicating. God communicates the world into being. Now, in a civilizational discursivity nurtured, but I'll just say this quickly, this is really what we would call a chidush, if you compare it to the ancient Near Eastern texts. The idea of creatio ex nihilo, if you know of texts like the Enuma Elish, the Sumerian myths, and all the Near Eastern myths, usually the gods create by ripping off a part of their body, or by ejaculating, or by whatever. There's only one instance I know of in Egyptian mythology, and even there it's questionable, where the gods create by speaking. That is a novelty in the biblical text, which, by the way, was underscored by the great scholar Yechezkel Kaufman. The biblical account of creation of the world must needs scandalize the Near Eastern cosmogonies, not just because a new rule, ex nihilo fit ens creatum, from nothing comes a created entity, transgresses the conservation rule, but because this transgression allows the pre-cosmogonic situation to sabotage the resulting cosmos. The primeval nothing wreaks havoc deep within the fibers of something. And the significance of the Hebrew alphabet as the medium of creation lies in the intimate connection between this nothing prior to creation, and the words whereby the world comes to be. The words conspire with the nothing inside the very headquarters of the something to bring the something down by a kind of conspiracy. What are words, after all? Materially speaking, nothing. Which brings the comparison between metaphysics and the Torah to the trenchant point of difference between the metaphysical nihil, that is the clear night of the nothing of anxiety, and the alternative basic mood proper to the nothingness in the biblical account of creation. And here again, I could pull many texts out from the shelf to guide an explication of the difference between them. The Shar Yichud Ve'Hamunah of Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, whom I just quoted, the Hasidic master, the first Hasidic master of Chabad, invoked the above explanation of the Sefer Yetzirah, happens to my mind to be an especially convenient text for also explicating the this difference due to the extreme, this is why I think it's a good text, due to the extreme prejudice whereby this text rejects not just the pagan metaphysics of ex nihilo nihil fit, but also the commonplace Jewish versions of creatio ex nihilo, which make room for an ens creatum, a created thing, and the great aggregate of beings known as cosmos, as the world. The text reads like a psalmodic hymn to the nihil tremendum, which antedates, which is prior to creation. Here I quote, "It is written, forever, O God, your words stand firm in the heavens." The Baal Shem Tov of blessed memory explained this as follows: "Your word, which you uttered during creation, let there be a firmament, a rakia, in the midst of the waters." These very words, that sentence that God says, these words stand firmly and forever within the heavenly firmament, in the rakia, and are forever clothed within it, and within all the heavens that give them life. As it is written, the word of our God shall stand firm forever. So the words, according to the Baal Shem Tov, are embedded, as it were, in reality. They can't be accessed by a good telescope or a good microscope. They are, of course, semantically embedded in reality. Creation as a whole is a divine semantic gesture, and things exist by virtue of a semantic dependence on the divine words that constantly re-utter them ex nihilo from instant to instant. It is specifically the alphabetic semantic truth of things to which their existence is related as a kind of predicate, furthermore, that the accounts for the overwhelming faithfulness and availability of God in the nothingness of things. To the total inner ontological emptiness of the world corresponds the infinite fullness of God. And I will not quote this next text, just because I'm trying to speed things up, but basically the Alter Rebbe says that the things are held together by the breath of God. It's God's breath. In other words, what God says holds things together. So the emptiness of things corresponds to the fullness of God's words. There's a fullness. It's a divine fullness. It's primarily on the basis of these texts that the Hasidic teachings characterized by Gershom Sholem as the last original contribution to Kabbalistic thinking, namely the teachings of Rab Shneir Zalman, which are known under the acronym Chabad, were branded by Sholem as acosmistic, not I'll use both words, acosmistic and acosmic, but he says acosmistic in the English version, which is what makes Chabad literature a very useful lens-like device for bringing into focus and emphasizing the acosmic aspect of Jewish teaching in general. With this lens in hands, it only needs some browsing work in a library, which I would love to do in Eliot's library, to find the same acosmism in the writings of Shneir Zalman's predecessors, Rabbi Yehuda Lev of the Maharal of Prague, for example, the Shla Kodesh, Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, and Rav Cordovero. This idea exists in all of these texts. If you're interested, I can give you the exact pages where you find this acosmic teaching. In other words, it's not a Chabad teaching. And Chabad became a major, important theme, but it's definitely not created by Chabad, the masters. More significantly, perhaps, it is just as readily found in the single greatest anti-Hasidic, anti-Chabad text, the Nefesh Chaim of Chaim of Volozhin. He also, I won't quote the text here, but he also says that Ein od milvado is an essential truth in the Torah. In other words, He quotes this text, which is always quoted in these acosmitistic Chabad teachings from Deuteronomy 4:3-5. To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord your God, that he is God, Ein od milvado, which simply means there is no other God, but which in these acosmistic teachings means there is nothing but God. There is only God. There is no world. There's also, by the way, I found a beautiful example of this, quite surprisingly, in Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen also says this, he uses Ein od milvado and brings this as a Jewish teaching. The odd phrase cited from Deuteronomy 4:3-5 is a key to the acosmic teaching, both in the text above and in Chabad literature, Ein od milvado. The key word in this phrase is od, which means more. The original context in which this word appears may be recalled. Moses is addressing his people in the plains of Moab. As if engaging in an exercise of comparative religion, he asks them to try to recall whether they've heard of any other accounts told by any of the peoples of the Mediterranean world or anywhere beyond, if they've ever heard of a relationship such as they have with God. This is a quote now from Deuteronomy. Moses says, "Has a God ever sought to go out and make for himself a nation in the midst of another nation by temptations and signs and wonders and by war and so on?" He says, "To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord God, He is God. There is nothing more than He Himself. Ein od milvado." The elliptical form of the last Hebrew phrase invites interpretation. What does more mean here? The simplest interpretation assumes that the issue is idolatry. That's the assumption. The more refers to other gods. There is no gods besides Him. Monotheism is under siege. The gates need to be barred. But this simple interpretation does not satisfy Reb Schneur Zalman or the Volozhiner or the Maharal of Prague or the Shla Kodesh. The object is to be qualified by a more that is not merely another God. As I said, it's everything. Ein od milvado means there is no world. There is nothing besides Him. There is nothing but God. Even the heaven and the earth and everything beneath it, all of that is secondary. The metaphysical thinking, where metaphysical thinking, by contrast, is preoccupied with the basic theological question of whether there is something more than the world. For Hasidic Kabbalistic teaching, the basic question is whether there is something more than God, not more than the world, but is there anything other than God? That's the Hasidic question. In all these texts, it's critical to note we have to be careful not to read the nothing and the mores and the lesses in terms of metaphysical quanta. We're not talking here about liquids, about more and less. We're not pouring oil into water and talking about quantities. I don't think we're even talking about what in the Eastern philosophy is called Maya, the realm of illusion, or even what Berkeley, the great empiricist, when he talks about, when he says, esse est percipi, the perception is everything, but rather the Jewish depreciation of the phenomenal world is a less that diminishes the world's existential gravitas, its ponderous weight as a concerned totality. To understand this depreciated more, in other words, the Heideggerian notion of worldhood, proves to be quite indispensable in staving off metaphysical and epistemological interpretations of it. And this aid cannot come too soon because, unfortunately, such an interpretation is already in Sholom's use of the word acosmistic. After all, what is Genesis 1 if not an account of how God installs just such a cosmos from the ground up amid the repeated "it was good"? As Reb Shmuel, the great-grandson of Reb Schneur Zalman, observes, For it is said this only as things appear to us when it's written. Basically, I would say that, the Chabad masters, a few of them, the Rebbe Rashab, also the fifth master, emphasizes that Ein od milvado, the teaching of acosmism, doesn't mean that there literally is no world and this is an illusion. And they bring an important text to discuss this is from the Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin, where there's a picking of cucumbers that is done by magic, and they say, in which there's a question there of whether the one who magically picked cucumbers, Levinas discusses this text, should be punished, and it's capital punishment, actually sorcery. It's a halachic question, and the upshot of it is, of course, it would be halachically meaningless to accuse a sorcerer of sorcery if there weren't a real world that he was actually dealing with. So the world is real. Ein od milvado is not that the world is an illusion, it's that the world is insubstantial. So I would prefer to use the word, not when talking about the ontology of acosmism, I don't think it's so much ontology as what I would call ontorhetorics. It's a rhetorical issue. A rhetorical issue that is as deep as being.